So I'd like to welcome everyone today. My name is Barbara Morningstar. I'm with In Autumn's Cocoon Education. We're actually filming from Canada in the Vancouver, British Columbia area. Just to give you a little bit of a background, if you and I have not met before, and then I will introduce my guest. I started in the hospice field over 25 years ago and worked at 3 different hospice societies in British Columbia. Sadly, my husband died of cancer in 2008. So I've been on both sides of the experience, both professionally and personally, supporting someone at end of life. I launched In Autumn's Cocoon Education in the fall of 2017 to start opening the dialogue more about death, dying, and grief, and helping to educate people with a very sensitive subject. So I do speaking engagements, and I'm an author and presenter. But I'm diving into a new way of communicating and sharing with you today to start this interview series. I want to call it digging deeper, diving deeper, because I love to go to the deep places. And I was reflecting on starting this interview series because the gift of working in this field is I get to, and my beautiful guest here is who I'll introduce in a minute, we get to interact with amazing professionals and individuals in end-of-life care, in grief support, in the mystery of life and death. And in my local area in Vancouver, there's phenomenal wisdom. And I've met beautiful people internationally in the field, professionally too, that I thought, I have these rich conversations all the time, and how often do people get to listen in on them? So today I'm starting this interview series so that you get the gift of listening in on these conversations that you normally would not get to hear, and the wisdom that you will learn from in the exchange and in the richness of the conversation, right? So today, and she's brave because this is my first interview, I am so grateful to introduce you to Janie Brown. And Janie is the executive director and co-founder of Callanish, which is a nonprofit organization, and they have a beautiful counseling center in Vancouver, British Columbia, where they support individuals living with cancer and traversing the life experience with that, the invitation of that illness and all that it comes to teach them, and how I want to say it, I'm going to let you say that in a better way, but I want to honor that when an illness comes in to someone's life, it doesn't have, it can enrich life if you're open to the invitation, even though it can be challenging, right? And Janie's going to elaborate on that more. So they do counseling in the Vancouver area, and they also often do retreats in close to Whistler. But right now with COVID, they've had to do a little bit of a dance around that. Janie's also the author of a new book, Radical Acts of Love, and we're going to talk a little bit more about her life experience in the book. So first of all, though, you're from Glasgow in Scotland, and Callanish. I mean, a lot of us are seeing Outlander and Claire and the magical stones, but the stones and the metaphor of Callanish, what's the meaning of that for you? Why Callanish?
Well, it's one of those funny things that we tried to come up with a name for our organization, and so oftentimes we choose a name that ends up connecting with a disease, say Cancer Society, something Cancer Society, and right from the very beginning, we felt that we wanted to have a name that didn't necessarily associate with specifically a disease, more a name that would actually take people into, oh, I wonder what Callanish is, like a curiosity, which I think is how so many people actually enter into an illness experience and a death experience if they're given the right supports and they have the community around them to say, could this be something we enter into with curiosity? Mm-hmm. So we chose the name Callanish. I'm from Scotland, so I was born and raised. All my ancestors on both sides are Scottish. So that's, that could be considered a gift or a curse, depending on how you look at it. Most people who know me think of me as a very quiet but feisty person, and I think that I come by that lineage with a great deal of privilege. I feel so. Callanish is the largest standing stone circle in the Outer Hebrides, which is the chain of islands off the northwest coast of Scotland. Starts with the Isle of Lewis and goes all the way down. There's about 9 or 10 different islands, and the island of Lewis houses the Callanish standing stones, and they are 56, I believe, standing stones, and they're on the top of a hill. And I've been there now 3 times, and every time I enter the path that takes you up this winding hill, and you walk onto the site, it's barren, it's grassy, there's a few dotted crofts or cottages around. And every time I've been, there's only been there 3 times, I'll go again, I'm sure, but my heart starts to beat fast. There's a kind of quickening. And I think, what is that? And I've understood it now as it happens in my life. It happens when I sit in circles with people who are, in a sacred space, looking to explore the mystery of life and death. And so to me, Callanish was a perfect name for, one, being a circle of stones. There's actually a circle of stones, and there's 4 pathways coming from those stones, and there's one center stone. And it is a place that to me just enlivens. And I can't describe it other than the mystery of these stones being placed there 5,000 years ago for reasons we still don't fully understand. But the people who put them there, I'm sure, understood what they were doing. And that we know that it has a direct connection to the moon, as opposed to Stonehenge that has a direct communication and connection with the sun. So I do love, I love the metaphor of the darkness and what we can find in the darkness. And obviously the moon can light our way in the darkness. So there were a lot of reasons that this word Callanish, this place Callanish, and actually the sound of the word is so soft. The Gaelic name is Callanay, but I love Callanish. So we chose the name. And of course, then, as happens, we choose a name that then becomes part of our lore and our history. And so many of our participants who've come to Callanish with cancer have actually ended up going on a pilgrimage. And it's a long way. It's 5 hours across the North Sea to the island of Lewis on a usually very rainy, rocky ferry ride where the bar is filled with accordion singers and, lots of alcohol at, 12 years. And it feels like, you go on a journey to get there, but it's a very, it's a place that makes you feel like you belong to some eternal lineage. And when I got there and I put my hand on the first standing stone, I felt 5,000 years of people who'd done that before me. It was like that same rock had this, all these different hands. And there's these beautiful photographs of people wearing the women in their long clothes, the first photographs of people standing, just as I was, putting my hand on those stones. So it feels to me it's a lot about connection to our ancestry, to our lineages, and to this mystery that is so inherent in the work that we do with people who are living with illness and facing the end of life. And what is death? How do we do that? We know it's unknown. We know it's uncertain. And that uncertainty can be, as we know, terrifying, or it can be, we can be curious about it. So that's a long answer to your question. But of course, it's a very precious name to me now because we've been 25 years creating and developing programs under the umbrella of the Callanish Society. And it's been just a rich and deeply beautiful journey for me personally, having come out of the healthcare world, the healthcare profession as a nurse, and also as a clinical nurse specialist with counseling, that, it's just been a beautiful way to really dedicate my life's work to exploring the mystery and helping people face into, how to do this thing called life, especially when it's challenged, when it's shorter than maybe we'd hope it would be. How do you live from that point of knowing that you will die from this illness? You will likely die from this illness. How do you live that and live it without the illness being central to your life? It has to be, because there's treatments and associated with that, but there's elements of who we are as people that go underground, I think, when we're diagnosed. And I think that we need to spend time enhancing and remembering these parts of us so that we don't just feel like an illness. We feel like a person with an illness, and maybe that we can develop are essentials of living, even in that process, which I know you deeply understand from your life's work also.
Mhm. Well, and I just want to say that is one of the things I have a deep respect for with you and Callanish. Daphne Loved, one of the co-founders as well, and she's a palliative physician that I met through my work as a program director with a hospice society over the years. But there was a turning point for you, as you said. Your background was in as an oncology nurse, and then it was all about the illness and the physical elements of it, and then your heart just had this calling to take it to a deeper place, to honor your own integrity and your respect for all the dimensions of the human being, which I love about Callanish too, is because you bring in nature and you bring in the senses. I mean, you just touching the stones, and in your retreats, you've got a beautiful film on your website where it shows young adults with cancer in the retreat center and sharing their journey, and the food and the arts and the senses and the creativity. I mean, you weave all of that in so beautifully to just invite the dimension of all of who we are, not just the physical element, right? So that's beautiful too. And I just have a deep respect for you that way. So
thank you.
So I just want to start. The book is stunning. It's stunning. So I really support people to get a copy of it. It's stories, and there's such heartfelt stories with the individuals that you've walked with, but also there's very practical information woven very subtly and beautifully in the book too. So there's a lot of layers of learning in your book. But I just want to start with a question about coming together with someone who's actually dealing with cancer. And about a year and a half ago, I was partnering a dear friend of mine. She's since died, and she was going through the cancer journey. And after an appointment I'd taken her to with her oncologist, we were sitting outside having lunch. And I said to her, I'm about to write a blog. And if you could tell me 2 things that you would like people to know about someone dealing with cancer, or something you would want them to really sit with and be aware of when they're with somebody with cancer, what would they be? And the 2 things that she said, and I've just want to just reflect here, or tell people that there's no wrong way to face your death. Because she kept hearing this thing about a good death, and she was sitting in a room with some friends, and they were talking about all these spontaneous healings because someone had done their emotional work. And she said it was crazy because she was sitting here facing her death, and they were talking about, and she'd done emotional work, she'd eaten well, she'd done all these things. And she said they had no idea how crushing that was for her, because she was feeling like she was failing. So she said, please tell people there's no wrong way to do this. And the second thing was, we were talking about the beautiful film, The Horse Whisperer, and join up, like how a horse whisperer joins up with a horse, not trying to impose or direct, or just quietly waits and listens, and what I call blends. And she always loved the image of blending. So her second thing was, be careful with the energy that you bring around people who are dying. She said, if people come around, they're busy and trying to direct, she said, it's a lot of work for me. And I feel when they do that, she said, I know they're afraid. But the ones that come and just blend gently are just, so those are 2 powerful thoughts. And you mirror both of those points so beautifully in the book. So could you speak to there's no wrong way, and perhaps how to blend with someone artfully?
Thank you for the beautiful questions. They really go to the heart of the matter, don't they? And I think there's this attempt to say, if you do, 1 to 10, then you will create a perfect death, which to me means a death where you have your symptoms managed, your pain, managed, and you're at peace, and you've settled your life, and all the things that we would wish for. And I think of it a bit differently. I think that we can set up the conditions whereby that might happen. and is more likely to happen if we set up those conditions. I think that like birth, we can set up all the conditions for this perfect birth as we do, right? People set up this and we know the team we're going to have and we know where we're going to go and we make all these preparations and lo and behold, you know, the natural childbirth becomes a cesarean or a forceps. We've seen this so many times. And other deaths that were, you know, proposed or perceived that they would be difficult end up being. So this is the mystery. Mm-hmm. But I do love the idea, and I think in death we're further behind actually than in the birth movement. That in terms of us not necessarily even thinking through those conditions for a good death or a peaceful death, so I think we can start there to say, well, what are the questions that could set up that potential to happen? So if you say, well, I'm just going to really wait till death is upon me and then I'll figure it out. Now, if we said that to a woman in labor or in birth, you'd say, well, that is not going to work for you. And I think this is where it goes so badly wrong, when in a way the fear, and we can talk about fear and how to cultivate fearlessness, I think the fear in families often prevents these conditions for setting up the death that we could hope for. Again, it may go a different direction. So I think we have to be brave. We have to be, let's take some water. We have to be brave to say, okay, what are the things I can set up that are, you know, fairly straightforward to set up? So those are things like, let me think about where would I like to be? What kind of environment would I like to be in? Would it be a hospice? Would I feel safer in a hospital or a palliative care unit? Do you think I could die at home? And what would I need to be able to do that with the teams that I would need, the nursing teams, the care, the support, the medical teams? We need to figure out who will be our guides like we do in life. You know, we have teachers when we're little, you know, we have midwives when we're having birth, or physicians who help us give birth. But at the end of life, who do we have? And some people don't have family, and you can't rely, even if you do have family, that family will have the kind of fearlessness, the kind of capacity, the kind of energy that's required, like you had when you took care of your beloved. So we have to really get very honest with ourselves. What is it we need to do, and what can we do now? And of course, this whole advanced directive movement, getting our paperwork in order, getting our not leaving things for our family in a mess. I mean, this is very loving. I called my book Radical Acts of Love. It's a loving thing to do. What I don't want is for my family to have to literally clear out my closets for me, and, you know, clear up my financial mess, or clear up what a loving thing to think about ahead of time. And it doesn't mean superstitiously you're going to hasten that. And I think there's some of that in our culture where people think, oh, if I think about death, I'm going to hasten it. Well, it doesn't really work like that. I mean, look at all the cultures like in Tibet and the Buddhist traditions, where that's part of a deep meditation, a deep reflection, the end of life, impermanence, you know, how to live with that knowledge that we will all die. So I think setting up what I think of as conditions for healing, or conditions for a time in your life that could have people and an activation of the senses in a way that's pleasing. Like, so people will say, oh, music, this is kind of music I'd love, and I'd love to have, you know, massage. So it's wonderful to set these things in motion and have this plan like we do with birth, and know very well that may not end up happening. So we're talking about death from an illness. Of course, death comes in many forms and in many ways, sudden or otherwise. And we're talking mostly about a death that's foreseeable, that's you have a disease that you think and know will likely take your life. And I think we're blessed in a way if we have the time to do that. And the other part of that is the emotional and spiritual side of life. I mean, we can be very practical. We can, you know, set these things up. We can look at our medical team. We can think, oh, that's the physician that I would want at my side. That's the nurse or the care worker I would want. So that's wonderful to think about. But then you think about, well, how do I find this elusive peace? What does peace at the end of life mean? You know, what does a full heart mean at the end of life? And I think this is very much less talked about in the world of palliative care. How do I find peace? And this became very compelling for me, that I noticed that people would have experiences early in life, whether it's through their family of origin or some kind of trauma, some early loss or death. And at the end of life, it would come, and it would just be almost like surrounding them with this unfinished, unresolved stress, and can really preoccupy. And I think sometimes when you see people at the very end of life who are really restless, they're no longer able to communicate, but there's this deep restlessness you see, and they call it all sorts of different things now, existential distress and anguish. And I'm very curious about, if people have these unresolved things from early life. There are some people who would say, I would love to settle those. I mean, I really want to know how to. You can't say they never happened. You can't tie them up into a neat bow, but you can actually. There are people, and this is one of the things that Callanish really does now, is really help people settle those difficult things that have happened in our lives that could potentially lead to us having a peaceful death. Because I think that's the emotional, and there's many of those things, estranged families, we all talk about, this deathbed reunion. Well, let's get realistic, let's give it a try. Maybe then we can hope for that. And then there's the spiritual life. What does that mean to people? There are some people, and we can talk more about this, but there's a lot of people who have a deeply felt religion that's very important to them. Mm-hmm. And it's wonderful for those people who can rely on their church community. They can rely on their relationship with God. There are many others who have no belief system that there is a God or a higher power or anything after death. I spoke to this wonderful woman recently who'd actually been in hospital in her late 80s with COVID. And she said, when I thought I was going to die, she was very short of breath. And she said, to me, this is it. I die and then it's over. So she said, I'm not going to be carried by the belief in an afterlife. So there are a lot of people who are very clear that they don't have any belief about that. And then there's the other people who are interested and curious and have a sense of something that they call the spirit or an energy. And I'm very interested in those people and what that means to them. And how do we foster that and deepen that connection if that's useful to people? And I think it can often be people learning to understand, what does that really mean? This relationship to maybe this other part of me that's not my body. Is it my heart? Is it my soul? Everyone has different words for it. But I love the investigation of that. And what would it mean to build a stronger connection of steadiness, stability, fearlessness? Perhaps that part of us can help us to do that. And so that's a long answer to the question of, how do we step out of this vision of the perfect death, the good death? But I think there are many things we can do to actually up the chances that we could have a death where we're open, connected, peaceful, maybe even joyful. I mean, that seems like a stretch for some people, but I know you and I have been, in situations where people have died with this beautiful love of life, and this joy that even can come in, which is hard for some people to imagine. So yeah.
And there's an intimacy in it. I think, I was just even thinking as you were reflecting on that, sitting with a man once who'd been a pilot in the Second World War and never married, and going into his room and sitting on the edge of his bed just days before his death, and he was in deep reflection, looking at the floor, and the nurses had asked me to go in, and he's just down to skin and bone, and I put my hand on his shoulder and I said, it looks like you're in deep reflection. Is there anything that you'd like to share? And he said, I don't know if I can believe in God. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what to focus on. Mm-hmm. And so my question to him was, is there anyone or anything that when you think of that person or that thing, it makes your heart dance? Mm-hmm. That when you think of that person or that thing, it makes your chest just want to explode with love. And we went deeper into it. I'm not going to share. But the two things for him were his dog and nature. Mm-hmm. And that was our celebration. And he had a beautiful death as we worked with those images. So, I mean, what I love here is you're inviting in the uniqueness and the willingness to be curious with each individual as to what speaks to that individual's heart, and helps bring the love and the peace in when the fear starts to come up. So, and that's an art in itself.
Yeah. And how do we help healthcare professionals step into an openness? Because having, been an oncology nurse and a counselor for my career, I know that I was taught that it was my responsibility to lead people through a process in a way, like identify the problems, help people fix the problems. But really, I think that we need to, as best we can, lower our agendas for people. And I think we come in not just with agendas, we come in with belief systems. And there are many people come in with a belief system about, say, a spiritual life, or and the person saying, I don't believe anything happens after I die. So we have to be so honorable and honor this person's lifetime of thinking and sorting and believing what they believe. And I think we can get in the way so much. And as soon as someone feels that you're in the way because your agenda kind of comes out before you, they feel the agenda and then they wonder who's behind it.
Right.
Like that's kind of how it feels. Then I think that their doors just close a little bit more, and they just say, oh, okay, like you were saying, okay, well, I think this person can only go this place with me. And what we want, I think, truly, and especially for people who are still exploring, like this man you were describing, wants a real openness to say, can you go there with me? Can we go into the mystery without you thinking what's there as a professional? So we have a lot of work to do, and there's so many professionals who want to do this work to try, and it's, as Rachel Remen says, unlearn your training. It's wonderful. We need our education, but unlearn it so that you can truly be present to meet this person where they are. And, that's, again, a cliche, but it's actually something that takes a lot of dedication to just, oh, that's my belief. Oh, that's my assumption, right? And then how often we're surprised, aren't we? That when we let all that go, we're so surprised what can emerge between two people and in the intimacy of that space. It's beautiful. I mean, it really carries me every day. It lifts me into a place of, real delight that I don't know what this person needs, but I do know how to open a space to explore it. And sometimes I don't even do that very well, but I do my best.
Well, and I was gonna touch in on the depth of intimacy that can happen. In my last role, I was on site at a 10-bed hospice every day in the role that I was in. And one day, a gentleman in around his early 60s came out to get a cup of tea and was a little tired and asked if I would bring the tea into his room. And as I sat, he was waiting for his wife, and he looked at me and he said, I love my wife so deeply, and we've always had an amazing relationship. But the depth of intimacy that I'm experiencing now, I can't even put it into words. He said, it's surprising me. I didn't tell him I was a widow myself at the time, but I knew exactly what he meant. I mean, there's an element of the sexuality that changes as an illness moves in, and there's an art in working with that, and then it's touch and hand holding it. But he was going to a deeper place in that, because when an illness comes into that depth, all of this stuff is moved out of the way, and there's a devotion and awareness of a shortness of time, but it's the connection and the vulnerability is so raw and authentic. And how blessed we are to step into that with people in this work and have it. But it's also an art, as you say, to give it space. You do it so beautifully in your work and in your book. Your stories give such brilliant examples of it. But there's a lot of courage to go into that depth of intimacy. And then in the reality of going into it with a partner, a loved one, but as a professional, to be open but boundaried at that. I did a beautiful support group last night with lead palliative docs and some nurses from the area, and they were talking about the art of staying open but holding a boundary. And there, so intimacy is rich. And how do you traverse holding that space in a way that makes the container safe, but also healthy, if I don't know a better word to put it in?
Well, I think it's that's a lot to do with how much space we can create inside. And I suppose that's what I've spent a lot of years trying to understand what that means. So, and I think we can be spacious inside when we learn, what's our baggage, first of all, and can I do something about that? I mean, really, not everyone can afford to go to therapy, but if you can, there's things that, if you could clear and literally clear spaces where you can find some peace and forgiveness and things that have happened, griefs that you hold tight, that you just never want to let go of people because there was some difficult death situation. You've just never been able to open up into spaciousness. So I think the internal space to me is where the work starts. How do I make space in here? There's a man who I just loved. He died of cancer a few years ago. He was he was a spiritual teacher who would never call himself that. His name was David LaChapelle. And I met him in a little tent in the middle of Mount Rainier National Park where I had set up a meeting with him. And I was picturing, the guru with the white clothes and everything. I was going to go and have a session with him. And I got to the camp. He said, meet me in my tent at the campsite. And I was picturing the marquee and, the guy on the... And I found this tiny little pup tent for three. It was just, I thought, this can't be it. So, hello, said hello. I was there with two friends. He said, hi. And he opened the door and he just looked like he'd been dragged, they say in Scotland, dragged through a hedge backwards. His hair was just this. And I was thinking, this is my guru. Like, this is like, not going to work for me. But then he had little zafus to sit on, meditation cushions. And then he had a guitar and a vase of flowers. And he just started to say, could you mind if we chant together? So we sang a song that he wrote called We Are Coming Home. And talk about intimacy in this pouring rain in this tiny little tent. He sang and we sang. And coming home, of course, to him means coming home to yourself, to your heart. I just wept. Yeah. And then he said, he said a lot of things that day. We were there for several hours. But one of the things he said to me is the universe emanates from within. And I didn't ever really know what that meant. I still don't know if I do, but it stayed with me. And I think about that phrase every day in some ways. So what's inside me and what I emanate from that is what's received and is actually what shows up in my world outside of myself. So if you think about being with someone who's very troubled, anguished, and you end up walking through those doors and you sit in the presence of this person, first thing that happens is I want to help this person. I've got, what can I do? What can I do? And then you start to feel your own anxiety. Oh, I wonder what's wrong. How do I understand this? Cognitive. And then if you can settle, like these practices help us to do, especially mindfulness, meditation, any of the ways that we can calm ourselves, suddenly that's not where you're sitting in relation to this person. And if there's enough space inside, you can actually find a space to be at peace. Now that's really interesting to me because I wouldn't have known that except through my experiences. But the other thing I've noticed, and you probably can speak to this too, is that when I'm in the presence of someone who's actively dying, and I mean, that right at that point where the death canal, there's a turn and death is happening. That can be a few minutes or days before the person actually dies. There's something in the atmosphere of that room that brings that sensation inside of peace and spaciousness. So it's coming from inside, but it's also emanating from the actual, I don't know what that is, the energetic of dying itself. And even if the person's been restless and agitated, at some point there can be this calm. And I feel it as I just go into a sort of a timeless zone where I could sit there, it feels like forever in a space of quiet, sacred beauty of just, this is what's happening. And you listen to the breath, one breath and the next breath. And there's nothing, the mind can't even hold on to it really, except it might say, I wonder how long this is going to go on for, right? Oh, I wonder, is that the last breath? You know, the mind's chattering, but inside there's this spaciousness. So I suppose my hope is that we can declutter the inside world of each of us, which means not, you can't, you know, clear it all up, but you can, as we've talked about, find some peace with our life as we're living now, not as, you know, not as we're dying. If we can do that now, then I hope that translates to the end of our lives. And I hope it translates to the way we can be with people who are, you know, cluttered for obvious reasons. Life is messy. Mm-hmm. So that's the first part of your question. Is there more you want to talk about that?
Well, let me just bring in children here a little bit, because you don't just work with a person dealing with the illness. You're working with family, and talk about wisdom that we don't always give credit to. I mean, when I was in the first role at one of the hospices I worked for, Canuck Place opened in the mid-90s, and it was the first freestanding hospice for children in North America. And I decided to volunteer there, and had a profound, because I wanted to learn about pediatric palliative and just sibling grief. And one of the bedsides I ended up at was that of a 3-year-old. And I was playing with the 5-year-old sibling, and then went in and sat while mom went downstairs. And the little 5-year-old was coming in and jumping on the bed and reflecting on her little brother. And this was literally like 24 to 48 hours. He was unresponsive. It was stunning. And in the section in your book where you talk about opening the heart to love, there's a stunning story about a memory box and Daniel and a little 7-year-old daughter who happened to come along, and then just how artfully, with such love, you invited her into the conversation. It's often, you know, we used to have babies at home and die at home, and the kids were running in and out like that. And now not you and I, but most North Americans have never seen a death, and they're afraid of it. So they want to protect the children, but it's actually inviting them into life and love and relationship. So could you even speak to that story and the beauty of the kisses and the flower petals at the end, and what the children brought just organically? It was just magnificent.
Well, I mean, I think if children are given a chance, they can really be present. And I think that is up to the adults to, you know, again, this deep instinct to protect our children. You have to kind of work against it, because it does want us to keep children away from pain. And if we perceive this as pain, then we'll want to. So that's how most people deal with death, is keep the children away. And I think the children, from my experience, are curious. They might be anxious if there's things happening that they don't understand. So they need guidance. They need information to say, and they need to not be present if there's something severely traumatic happening. And that's in my view. I wouldn't want to expose a child to something where they really can't understand, and that the adults are drawn up in a big trauma. So that would be one thing. But for the most part, when, you know, a person is dying and their symptoms are pretty well managed, then, as you said, if someone's at home or in hospital or hospice, children come and go. And I love the idea of just letting them decide. And this particular story in my book was, I was working with a young man in his 30s with 2 daughters, 6 and 8, and he had to bring one of his daughters for his counseling session because their mother had come down with a migraine that day, and she had nowhere to go. So he brought her, and I had in that time, a waiting room I could lock. So she brought her coloring books and sat down in the waiting room. And I said, come and knock on this door here. Your daddy and I will be in here if you want to come and talk to us. So she was quite happy, and I'd never met her before, but I could tell the way she looked at me. You know, you can tell a lot about kids. You know, are they connecting? Are they, you know, what kind of child is this? And I think this is important. There are some children who have greater capacity than others, you know, and there's some children who, you know, are anxious, inherited anxiety often from parents, but, you know, who were born with that sensitivity. So you have to really gauge the children, but she was obviously a kid that she was happy to sit in the waiting room on her own. That told me something of her resilience. And so she came in, she heard the little knock at the door. I think actually we went out and checked on her, and she came in and sat down, and this conversation ensued where she said, well, what were you talking about? And of course, he's like, well, should we say? He's looking at me. And I said, well, yeah, we were talking about how ill your daddy is. And she said, yes, I know he's going to die like that. And he didn't know that she knew that. In fact, the family system had been such that they didn't want to really talk about dying, his wife and his in-laws. And so he hadn't really brought the kids into that conversation, but he was talking to me to find out, well, how do I do that? Could I help the kids prepare? And so this is where it all started. And so we ended up in this beautiful conversation in a way that was very hard. I mean, I had oftentimes my eyes were filled up, as happens. I wasn't on the floor sobbing, but I was really moved by this father-daughter conversation. And it ended up with this, really creative idea where, I suggested that sometimes children create memory boxes with their parents or their grandparents who are dying, and they're to create memories of things that would be helpful after, so that what do you miss, what do you think you'll miss when your daddy's not here? And she came up with this, I would never imagined her saying this, but she said, I'll miss his kisses. And I thought, well, yeah, I get that. So kiss obviously is very, and so he's now, he's starting to cry. And then she had this beautiful question for him, like, well, what if I said to her, because I thought, I have no idea how you put kisses in a memory box. So I thought, well, she obviously knows, she's got a vision for this, which is the point, right? She's got, children are creative and they know how to prepare. So she said, well, Daddy, if you kiss pieces of paper, if you put your mommy's lipstick on your lips, and then you kiss pieces of paper, and then we cut out those pieces of paper, we could put them in the box. And then when I need a kiss, I could pull it out. So I looked at him, he looked at me.
And yeah, I was reading that in the book, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is stunning. This child is brilliant in her heart, right?
She knew that would. And so, of course, he said, sure, and then it kind of carried on from there, where when he was actually dying, and in fact, after he died quite suddenly, and the kids weren't there because it was sort of an early morning death. And but I often say to the other parent to, if you think your child would want, why don't you ask them if they'd like to see the parent who's died or the grandparent? And so kids often know, even at that young age, they'll say absolutely not. And then you'll say, well, if you went in with me, would you want to? No. So again, honoring their wisdom. And these two girls wanted to go in, and then they came up with the ceremony. Again, ceremony so deeply intuitive, if we're allowed to, and asked her mom if they could take the petals off the flowers around his bed that visitors had brought. And then they just basically decorated his bed with these petals and had his, put Daddy on there. And I mean, it's sort of, you couldn't make that up. You couldn't really construct that. So that's what I mean about, in a way, creating space and just believing that there's an intelligence. And I think this is true of our death too, that I believe there is an intelligence, that we know how to die. And I think there's an intelligence, we know how to grieve, and we know how to do ceremony, and we know how to be creative. We're born with these things. So if we could just make space for those possibilities, then what it does to me is it adds beauty into the mix of heartbreak and tragedy. And so this beauty that children, even that conversation about the memory box, I could see how much he was so moved by his own daughter, and that she came up with this idea and she was excited to do it. And you'd think, how could a kid be excited about making something for after he's dead? Nobody would really believe that's possible. But I've seen it so many times that kids know what to do if they're given just, what do you think? What do you think we could do? And this is, again, basic parenting, but it's not when you're in the midst of a tragedy. You're just protect. So thank you for the question. It's something that's very near and dear to my heart, that I've We work with a lot of young people with children here at Calnish, a lot of people with stage 4 cancer. And it's the hardest work I do, is to work with families where they're going to be leaving young children. I mean, it just every time breaks your heart. I mean, you just can't do the work without having your heart break. And I wouldn't want to do it without that happening. And that, because then I'm somehow separate from the tragedy of that. But it's nice to have been working now 30 years in the field, that I can say to parents how children do after that. Like, how do children, how do you help children be resilient? And it's often in the way that they've been loved as children. And I say, if you've kept your children safe and they know they're loved, they have a deep resilience. And I see that. Some of the children that I followed for years since their parents died when they were young, when the children were young. I've seen these kids, some of them are in their 20s, I still see. And I mean, they're more deeply human, compassionate people who, when you've had a loss early in life, you understand loss and you understand people's pain. And a lot of these children become just, incredibly deeply compassionate. And sometimes they lose their way. I've had a lot of kids who lose their way for a time, because it seems like the worst thing that could ever happen. And then they find their way back, most of them. So yeah, it's a heartbreaking, but again, it's inspiring to see what's capable in the depths of sadness and in the depths of, something you just feels impossible. And out of that, these seeds, you've seen this many times yourself in your work, these seeds get planted and they grow. And I'm so glad I have enough years now, probably like you, where I don't doubt like I used to doubt in the early days, where like, really, I could talk to a child about that and it wouldn't hurt them. So I'm so grateful for all the mentors who've shown me the way. And I've watched other people talk to children about these things. I thought, oh no, the children seem okay. I haven't traumatized them. So we're lucky if we have mentors who can. And then we can then become mentors to parents and grandparents. There's so many children so close to their grandparents. It's a huge loss when grandparents die.
Well, and I love that story, because one of the things I think you're brilliant at is ritual, which we've lost a lot of in so many ways now, like inviting ritual in. And we're feeling it now because people aren't able to have the funeral ceremonies and the burials the way they used to, and how important that is, right? So ritual and just the creativity and the wisdom in the room. I mean, you guided the father, and he learned and was moved by the wisdom and love and beauty and connection with the child, right? So just we're coming close to the end. There's a few little, well, not little, there's lots. I could keep you on for a long time, just so we could learn from the beauty of what you know and your wisdom. But we talked a little bit I'm going to go into a bit of a harder reflection, this word denial that we hear sometimes. And I have a bit of a thing about that word. I know it. And you and I talked about when words are used a little bit too casually at times. It's not saying that people aren't struggling with that. But I remember once being in medical rounds on the palliative unit, and the team said, oh, there's a woman who's just arrived, and they had social workers on the unit. My team would come in, we had volunteers, and I had clinical counselors on my staff. So they asked me to go and work with a social worker, but check in with a patient, because they felt she was in denial and did she need more help? And so I went into the room and I sat with her, and she'd had some untoward event, like a bleed out or something that was quite dramatic to come in. And so I sat with her, and she instantly went into this deep reflection about what was happening with her body and how she'd come into the hospital. And I said to her, do you understand you have a terminal illness? And she said, yes. And I said, can you share a bit of the events that brought you here? And they were quite dramatic. And I said, do you understand your body is getting weaker? She said, yes. I said, are you aware you're dying? She said, yes. But then she looked at me and she said, I know I'm dying. I know I'm dying. But how do I know when I'm dying, how it feels when I'm, and I went, oh, so I had to lean into her differently
Mm-hmm.
because here was this subtle sort of thing of our deeper, phenomenal life instinct of survival at play.
Mm-hmm.
She was aware of it,
Mm-hmm.
engaged in life, but had a deeper question of like, what does it really feel like when I actually start to move away from this thing here into this? And of course, I couldn't answer that for her. I said, I've never been through that process. I can't tell you what that feels like. And then I turned the question back to her. But even in the wisdom and resiliency of children, there's this sort of I've trained people and they come in thinking the person's going to talk about death all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And often it's not like that at all. They're slowly coming to terms with the dying, but life is still.
Mm-hmm.
So hope, you speak of hope and
Mm-hmm.
this deep survival instinct. Like, can you just touch on that? And then we'll kind of go into some last minute things. But this is a powerful question and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, but not so subtle, like subtle, but not so subtle dynamic at play around the mystery of life and this rich element of who we are, right?
Well, I mean, I think if denial is a defense, it's a structure that we get defended, then I look at what helps us to become undefended so that we might be able to talk about the fact that we are dying if we're that close. Because there are people, as you say, I've met many who will not talk about the fact that they're dying. And somehow, I think our agenda again of feeling that people should talk about dying and it's better for them to talk about dying, then that belief structure in me helps to contribute to the defense of denial. And so I don't use that term denial because I think it has it's got a sort of judgmental feeling to it that when people use it. So I know that in the literatures as well, we all understand there's denial and that we can support that denial. But I think if we were really honest, I think we have certain kinds of deaths that we want to see. And normally they're deaths where families are talking, they're open, they're more. And of course, that's what I'm saying. Can we set up the conditions whereby that can happen? It seems like it's often a much easier passage when there's that kind of openness. We've seen people die in denial, if you want to call it that, where the defense is up and the will structure is activated. And I'm out on the golf course next week. I write a story about that in my book. And says to his wife, no, I'm getting back on the golf course. And she's saying, we've got to talk about wills. We have to talk about. And he's saying, no, I'm not doing that. And that's a defense, right? So what was it about her, and this is where you can help work with people, that would keep his defense in place? And I'm not blaming, there's no blame to her. This is their dynamic. And I would say this dynamic between couples has usually been there for many years. So when you see it in a family, you think, okay, how have they communicated? Have they had open communication? Probably not. But this situation with this couple, this lovely Scottish couple that I worked with in their home, that's in the book, when she left the room to make tea, because she's trying, her agenda was get Janie in and make him talk about dying. You probably had lots of people want you to do that for them, right? Just get them to open up. It's blah, blah, blah. So you go in and you think, oh, I mean, you can't be set up like that, really, can you? I mean, it's really a hard thing to go into a situation, because in a way you have to respect that there's a reason that he wants to do it this way. I mean, that there's an intelligence, even if it's not even a cognitive reason he's figured out, it's just his body's gone into. And when she left to make tea, he quickly said to me, well, I know I'm dying, but I can't tell her because I'm scared for her. I think she'll be so upset and she won't be able to cope. And if I hold it together, then she'll not fall apart. And I said to him, that's the most loving thing I've heard today. That is an expression of love. So it would turn things around a bit if we said denial rather than, oh, it's a harmful thing for the person who's dying and for the family. For the family, what if it's an expression of love? And what even if for ourselves, what is it? Maybe we want to go out feeling like we're living, and is that our right? And I talk a lot about hope, and I think my next book's going to be about hope, because I'm very interested in And you know how in many, probably three decades ago, we used to talk about pain. And the first, it was all very exciting. And we defined pain. Pain is what the person says it is. And that became, we have to believe people. And so I think that way about hope, what if hope is what the person says it is? Because we come in and say, well, that's unrealistic. You're going to get to your grandchild's graduation next summer. But what harm is done? And I think we underestimate people's intelligence, that they know perfectly well how ill they are. They've been told the news. They've been told often more times than they need to be told that this disease is going to take their life. And I think, again, some physicians feel like, got to get it clear here. And then they still say, well, I'm going to live till after my, grandchild's graduated. And I think, well, why not? Why not? I mean, what's wrong with that? It really, if the person has full understanding. And even if they decide they're not going to get their affairs in order, can we be okay with that? We can try and help and suggest things. But if there's a denial that's so tight, or a part of them knows perfectly well they're dying, as you said, that they're actually saying, I'm choosing this way. Right? Sometimes when we try with people, I mean, I've done this, and I'm sure you have, where you feel a slight opening of a door, there seems like it's all buttoned down, I'm not going there. And then something happens. And again, this is this presence. So you can just sit there, and suddenly there'll be a little opening, and I think of it as a doorway. And I think, well, I'm just going to go through the door and see how I get on with that, and it might just be to say, have you thought about the what ifs? I know that I'm going to hope with you too, that you get to your daughter's graduation. I fully, stand with you in that hope. But what if that isn't how it goes? Have you thought about that? What happens if it doesn't go the way you hope? So rather than saying there's no hope, you're saying, well, let's hold the hope and let's see if we can just open the doorway a little. And oftentimes people will step through that doorway because you haven't said, well, there's no hope, so we have to talk about this. So I think it's a very complicated and actually very, very interesting part of our human nature. And I always say, I'm going to be one of these old Scottish people who are just like completely ornery and like, I'm not dying. I'm sure I'll be one of these people that and all my nursing and doctors are like, oh no, she's going to be one of these ones, the Dylan Thomas poem, because I have such a strong will structure. I know that about myself. So am I going to be able to soften in, which I think is what surrender is? And I will only be able to surrender if I have people who aren't loading a bunch of shoulds and agendas and you should be thinking this. And like, I'm just like one of these people that does the opposite. So I know that about myself. So my personality might be a bit tricky. Like I think Kubler-Ross had that kind of ending.
Yes.
Yeah.
I met her in 93. She's an interesting character.
Yeah. So what if it's about softening, how do we help people soften and become undefended? It's a beautiful book called The Undefended Self. And that's what I'm trying to do in my life so that I don't get to the stage where I'm so defended. But I defend against people's judgments and agendas and what's right for me, because I want to find that myself. And I think that's what I want for the people I work with. I want to hear how you define hope, what you want to imagine is possible. And when you've lived this long in this work, I have seen things that are unexpected. And one young woman said to me at one point, you thought I was dying, didn't you? Because so I said, oh, we better get prepared. And the person, she turned around and lived another 5 years after that. So we must be willing to be surprised. And we must be willing to not lock things down so much and not be frightened of people's hope and feel that somehow we're not doing our job if we don't keep reminding people of. And the young adults say, they're very specific about it. They want to be able to hope and they want to believe that they can keep going. And I've learned to walk with them there. And then when it comes to the place where they turn and have to face death, they'll do it sometimes very fast in a few days. And then I'm here with you too. I'm here with just because, you've said you're not, and I'm with you, I'm going to turn with you. So you follow. And then they have the luxury of believing that there's possibility, which can help them live their lives so much, without possibility. So I always think that hope's really about hope about life. Maybe it's not hope about cure, but it's hope about life, meaningful life. And I think we mustn't take that away from people. And I still hear physicians doing that, and I hear stories, and it hurts me deeply when there's some sense that the person doesn't get it when they perfectly get it, and again, I think it's that deep responsibility that we have of, we've got to do this right. We have to help people come to terms with death and let them come in their own time, in their own way. And people do, they turn toward death when they do. And we can help them when they do turn, be there, and we can walk with them. Sometimes it feels, there's a story in the book, the very last story, about a woman I worked at Callanish with who ended up with a third cancer, a primary lung diagnosis. And, having worked with people with cancer for 10 years with me, she was fierce in her, her love of life, I would say, and her not wanting to let go into death. And I struggled. That's why I wrote the story. I struggled with that. I thought we'd be having these beautiful open conversations about dying, and until I realized that was my agenda. It was my agenda, and I thought it would be better for her. And even all these years later, I still, I got caught to say it's her death. She does it how she wants to do it, and I need to, to follow along.
Well, I think that's such a beautiful and profound kind of note to kind of gently, Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, and the influence he had on Dame Cicely Saunders in one of the first hospices in London. But meaning making and purpose is going to be unique to each person. Right. And as you say, you've got to be so careful not to bring in my friend who was dying didn't want to do chemo for years and years, avoided it, and then it was the best thing for pain management. And as she was dying, she kept going through this round of exhausting chemo for like a week of comfort, and it was total opposite to what she had wanted in her whole life, because she hated the idea of chemo. And I asked her at one point, I said, oh my goodness, like, you're putting yourself through. She said, I never realized the depth of my survival instinct and my love for life. And she said, I love it so much, I'm willing to go through this to still have a taste of it, but I know I'm dying.
Exactly.
And I had to step back from that and honor it. And she'd found meaning in that, even the roller coaster of that. So yeah, it's profound to step back and give space in a loving way, as you so beautifully show. It's artful. It brings our own challenges up. So beautiful work. So let me ask you one final question then.
Okay.
For you as an individual, and I ask this to the palliative docs I meet with often, like what's one of the greatest things in doing this work? How have you been changed by it? I mean, I know that sometimes is a cliche question too, but if you were really to sit in your heart, what is, as hard as being with people at end of life and the heartbreak of it, what is one of the greatest gifts, and how do you feel you've been transformed by it, by doing this work? What have they taught you?
Oh, it's such a good question, and it's such a big question. But if I were to distill it, I would say my love of life is greater than, it feels, year by year, it just gets more and more precious to me because of hearing, when people, sitting with people whose life is ending, and sometimes so quickly and suddenly, and just so I every day I get to imagine that's me. Like, I don't think we're separate. They happen to be sitting in that bed, I'm here. But so every day I die with them, in a sense, or I get a diagnosis with them, and I'm not afraid of that. Like, I don't think that will somehow make me less able to be there if I truly take that on just for a moment to say, oh, wow, okay, so how's that? So every day, this practice of, what if this is this finite life? What if it's this week? What if it truly is like that when you're around it. And I just feel more engaged with life. I really, it's really an amazing thing to be equipped like we are to navigate these, the trials and tribulations of illness and treatment, and get very close to it, very, very close to it. You're not having it, but you're very close to it. There's so much learning. And it comes up so often for me when I have something medical done. I think, well, I went for a COVID test recently, and everyone says, oh, it's like a brain biopsy. It's terrible, terrible. And I think the people I speak with every day, what they have to endure, a COVID test is going to be painful for 10 seconds. I can't be afraid of that. I mean, it's just, so those the ways that you get sturdy in it. And emotionally, physically, in other ways, you just get strengthened by the relations with people and their vulnerability. And I learn about my own vulnerabilities through them by putting myself in awe. It takes me to my knees, and I'm glad for it. Breaks my heart, and I'm glad for it, because I feel more human. I feel more access to a range of emotions that I don't know if I would have had access to, including joy and celebration and deep sorrow. I think if we're not afraid of our feelings, then we're not really afraid of life. So it's such a gift, and that's such a cliche, but it truly is remarkable. I'm following along with Michael Lerner. He's the head of Commonweal Center that runs retreats that we modeled after, and he's just had 3 months ago, major heart surgery, and and he's retreating from work in the way. And he said, work. I was a workaholic, but it wasn't a bad thing for me. I loved my work, and I became my work in the way that I became who I am because of my work. And I feel the same way. And now he's saying, but now at 77, after the surgery, I want to just be in pure life right now. Not because he didn't have it. He acknowledged that, that he didn't have the space. It's really, and so then I listen to him and I think, oh, wow, might become a time where I, get to go and sit on a bench for the morning and, breathe in the air. And so the intimacy of the friendships and relationships. And I always say we have to get very good at saying yes fully, because people say, how can you do this work? Well, you want to enter in for as short or as long a time as it is, the beginning and the end. We never know when we meet someone. And I want to say a full yes. And that translates into my life too, like a yes to engagement, to to say hello. I want to get to know who you are, even if I only know you for a week. I mean, it is amazing the people we get to meet. So that's a very long answer to your question.
No, but it's a beautiful answer. So I thank you so much. I just love you and Daphne and all that you do at Callanish. And so, of course, we've got COVID happening now, and your retreats, your stunning retreats near Whistler, we're so blessed to live in British Columbia, are on hold right now. But are the services at Callanish for counseling still available? Can you share a little bit about the work you do there and what's available for people in support of cancer?
Sure. I mean, the
journey right now.
Website has an amazing, so it's callanish.org, callanish.org. Beautiful. That's where really all the offerings are there. We're doing as much as we can online, which means it's accessible to people from all over. So we have meditation, writing, we have some art and ceremony work that we're doing now, and just there's lots of lovely things we can do at the center. We're doing it mostly on Zoom, but we do have a writing group in person where we're masked and we're sitting apart, and we've got air coming into the building.
Two of the young physicians, the palliative physicians I had in the group last night, they're going, we're in the writing group. We love the writing group. It was just helping them. It was just, they came alive when they talked about the writing. So it was beautiful to see.
Yeah, that was a lovely offering. We just decided these doctors working in the front lines, like you're supporting them too, is such a gift to be able to have them and get them to do some creative work. So so we'll get back to retreats. We're just as soon as we can and make it safe to do. But meanwhile, it's nice we have a center in Kitsilano where we can offer all sorts of different kinds of supports, and one-on-one therapy and one-on-one art therapy too. So
right. Yeah. And so I also want you to hold up your beautiful book.
Oh, my beautiful book. Here it is.
I got the audio version, and I got to hear your lovely voice, which, I love the tonality of it as you're doing it, but radical acts of love. And, when there's fear and there's the tender and challenging time, if you bring love and deep compassion and empathy in around those individuals, it can just soften, right? And so I love the title of the book, and I truly honor the work that you do.
Thank you so much.
Janie, I mean, it really, you're such an authentic human being, and the space that we were going to film there, and then we got distance, but because I wanted people to be in the sacred space of that, because the intent of what you do is so beautifully authentic. It's felt when you come into Callanish. So I honor you for that.
Well, thank you so much for your thoughtful questions. It kind of took me, I always have loved conversing with you, and thank you for inviting me. It's really a lovely way to be together, and I hope it's useful, and I'm available, email, whatever, in person. In masks.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it again, and being courageous enough to be my first guest.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Series too. Yeah.
Okay.
You'll have lovely conversations. Thanks.
You take care.